everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today I have a little color challenge for myself, a small one. My patrons picked this stunning bird as the color inspiration for this project, and I plan to dye multiple different colorways using a palette inspired by this bird. Now, looking at those 5 colors that were pulled by another source with the photo, I selected a number of different Dharma acid dye colors. I'm not going to use all of these, clearly, but I picked these colors both based on the swatch that Dharma has, but also looking at the times I've done crude swatches of my greens and my pinks to try to pick colors, and I'm going to narrow down the list. I want to try to pick colors that some of them might be subtle but have some differences to them. So we'll see how we go, but let's go look at the yarn. Today we're going to be dyeing Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn. Stroll is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. And it's probably the yarn base I've dyed more than absolutely any other ever. I have pre-soaked all of this yarn for around an hour or so in just some plain tap water, so it's nice and saturated. We'll add acid at various points in our other projects as we go, but having no acid in the pre-soak gives us the most flexibility. If you want to learn more about any of the tools, equipment, and dyes that I'm using in my videos, I have links and affiliate links down in the video description. And there's always a video content section, and I always list the dye colors that I use in a video in that section. So if you're ever curious about the actual colors I'm using, that's a place to go look. I picked a color palette that was forest green, Kelly green, deep magenta, pink orchid, and lichen for our first round, knowing that I could modify these colors later on. And for the first colorway, since I'm going to use a direct dry powder application, I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. This is the safety equipment that I always wear whenever I'm using dry dye powders. I added 300 grams of our pre-soaked stroll to the steam pan, but did not add any acid yet because I want to be able to spread these colors a bit through the yarn. I added a little bit of water, but not a ton, because I want to be able to sort of flip and move the yarn to get the colors all the way through. And I thought that for this variegated colorway, it would be fun to keep the colors in order that they were on that picture, with greens on either side and the pinks in the middle. This isn't the way that normally I would set things up. Normally I would put the greens all next to each other and the pinks next to each other, but this seemed fun, and I wanted to see what I thought of these colors together. I did have a yarn mop that was just off camera. That yarn mop didn't have any acid in it either, but once I got to the point of this project where I added acid after I was done adding all the color, I also added some acid to that yarn mop so that way the colors could start to strike there. The lichen maybe was a little too dark, and it definitely breaks a little bit. You get that more deeper green, but I like the balance of that color with the other 4. Even if I'm not referring to the picture, I like what it's doing. The pinks are very similar, but I knew their tones were different, and the way the pigments strike is different as well. Pink orchid can strike really, really fast. Something that I also noted after I added 6 tablespoons of vinegar to the pan and worked that through, the pink orchid had basically struck already. After adding the acid, I decided to just let things sit for 10 minutes before adding any other water. Now, I'm not expecting tons of color to have set, but a lot more has set with even just that addition of acid. There's a lot less color. I mean, there's definitely color left, but there's a lot less color left than there was before I added acid. And so this is a reason why I like to wait before I add more water and we go heat set. Now, I'm not adding any more acid with this water because I think we've added plenty of acid, but we could always end up adding more. But now I'm going to take this to the stove and we'll heat things for 30 minutes. I will increase the water volume if I need to. And as for our yarn mop, we have something very soft and very pastel because it wasn't powder as much that was left on my fingers, but dye water. And so I'm going to continue and use this for other things that might be more pastel, and we'll make another yarn mop that might be a little louder. It's been 30 minutes, and I just want to flip the yarn to see what we've got. Okay, we definitely have some spread. There are some lighter patches there. It's not perfect. That's okay. It's always risky when you're flipping things, but I don't mind. Oh, that's a bigger section. Okay, there are two small sections where I missed color, and I was just about to say I don't mind, but I mind a tiny bit, so I'm going to put my mask back on and add some color here. You can decide when your yarn is done whenever you want, but sometimes you might want to add something, and I thought I was going to be done and I was going to let it be what it was, but I just decided to add a little bit of color to correct it. Of course, I was wearing my respirator mask while I was doing this. We may discover some other lighter patches going on, but these ones seem a little bit bigger, and so that's just the reason why I am correcting them here. I did add a tiny bit of water before I added the dye just to increase the level of everything. And now I'm gonna turn off the heat and we can remove our yarn. Some white left in here isn't a problem. I just didn't want that large patch that I missed when I flipped the yarn. Oh, this is so fun and pretty. All right, I'm gonna set this aside to cool, and we're gonna keep this dye bath for another colorway. I will quickly wipe down the edges though, so that way we don't get immediate transfer onto our new yarn. Normally when I film videos, things are roughly in chronological order, but when I'm doing multiple different colorways, I do try to group things together. So there may be some jumping around back and forth. The yarn mops may suddenly have color on it that you didn't see me add because of where it was in the project, or I might be referring to a yarn mop that has less color than it did in another section. So please forgive me for that. I'm trying to keep things roughly grouped. So we'll see how that goes. I don't even know if the yarn mops are going to be all grouped together or sort of things about them maybe throughout the video. We'll see what editing Rebecca decides to do. For the next colorway, I decided to do some resist. And so I added onto dry yarn some zip ties about halfway through the middle of the skein. Then I folded it and added just one more zip tie. Because things are folded, that'll add some resist in here as well. Plus the pressure of the zip tie should block dye from getting in theory. I want to do something a little bit different, and I don't know if I'm going to regret this. It's a little bit silly, but I want to start off by adding some lichen to the bottom of my pan. Okay, that's a fair amount. And then I have a fresh yarn mop where I'm planning on wiping the dyes from my hands on, and just hopefully you could see already that that is way more intense and bright than this one, even though I still have no acid in here yet. And so that's why I'm using a different mop, so we can show some differences there. And now I've got our yarn, and so I'm sort of just plopping it down like so. And I am going to add a little bit more lichen, sort of in this little pattern. No idea how this will work out. I originally wasn't planning on adding any of the Kelly green for this stage, but let's do a little bit. I know it's in a different spot on each of them, but I'm going for, I don't know. I'm assuming that Kelly green, sort of like emerald green, is a color that spreads a lot. And so having a little in there may help us get a little bit more coverage. Okay, and now I'm coming in with our forest green. I have no idea what, if anything, adding the colors like this may do. But hopefully we'll add some dimension on the green layer, and we could dissolve some dye and add more dye, depending on what we see happening here.
Okay, but now I want to get some warm water and acid. This is 8 cups of warm water with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. And I'm just adding it on. And you can see we've got some dimension in here, but also some lighter patches. Okay, let's add some more water. The water is still a little warm, and I've got the same amount of acid in here. Okay. Aha, there are those lichens. I'm stirring this up a little bit because we don't have like full coverage of things at this point. I will probably want to dissolve more dye and add it on, but I thought it would be fun to start someplace that isn't sort of solid on the outside. And so let me remove this. Yeah, there's still a fair amount of white in here, but we have at least dimension on this layer. So when I cover this up with more green, we should be able to hopefully still maintain some dimension in there.
Off camera, I measured out 2 grams of the forest green acid dye and dissolved it in hot tap water, and then added that back to our pot along with 16 more cups of water and 4 tablespoons of white vinegar.
Okay, I still have my mask on, and I'm gonna bring over our yarn, and we're sort of going to dip it in to here. We don't need to move things a ton, but you can see we're going to get color coverage around a lot more of our yarn. Okay, now I'm going to go and heat set this until the dye bath is clear. We'll go ahead and check in after 15 to 30 minutes. It'll take a while for the dye bath to warm up, but we just want to set this green as much as possible.
Checking in on our yarn mops, I'm going to add a tablespoon-ish of white vinegar onto each. Here's our more pastel one that we use mostly for the variegated colorway. Just working this acid through. I'll still hang on to this in case I have light dye I want to add, but this is in contrast to this much more vibrant one. And you can see those greens are spreading that we have from when I was using the straight dye powder and didn't want to wipe that powder onto the yarn. So depending on the technique, you can have different vibrancy in the yarn, and this will get pinks in it later on, but now we have at least acid, so the colors will move around a little less. It's been about 20 minutes total, and the dye bath is mostly clear. So I'm going to remove the yarn so we can let it cool a little bit before we come back and hand paint with our pink. I know everything today is filmed a little bit out of order, but sometimes when I'm using yarn mops for many different projects, I like to quickly pop them into a steamer basket for a little bit, so that way it'll set some of the colors that we have locally and then allow us to add more color. Now I'm doing both mops at the same time right now, but you can see I've left space so they won't touch to avoid color transfer. So this doesn't necessarily need to be for a full 30 minutes unless I think I'm done with one of them, but even 5 or 10 minutes can be helpful. I'm going to remove the zip ties in real time on one. And I'm going to need to add regular ties to this as well, because we don't have a tie on here at all. So hopefully I can separate this awesome with no issue. And gosh, I would say that this looks really good. We've got a lot of coverage, but we still have reasonably sized white patches where we can add something else. Sometimes with resist, you can end up getting a lot more white than maybe you wanted. So it's always happy to get results like this. I popped my respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves back on. We have 6 blank spots for our resist here, but we have 4 colors that I'd like to use. The Lichen, Kelly Green, and the 2 pinks. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, let's just use one of the pinks. And then I can do something a little bit repeating with our 2 greens and then deep magenta. That way I can have things set up in a reasonable way. I came over with the dry dye powder and applied it to sections. There's still a reasonable amount of water in the yarn itself, so I'm able to tap the dry powder through the area. Maybe I might need to flip it and add some color to the other side of that section. But unlike when I tried to do this in the past, using some dyes mixed with citric acid powder already, using the straight dye powder, I can get the coverage I want really, really easily. And in fact, I had to be careful not to add too much color. I didn't put down any plastic wrap or anything, so I knew that when I went to go steam set it, we could have color transfer from the different sections. But I'm gonna try to group things and group like colors together so it can be a little bit similar. And well, then I went and I steam set everything for 30 minutes. Finally, because we had some dye left on the counter, I brought the yarn mops over and just wiped up everything. And then finally gave our yarn mops that final 30-minute heat set in the steamer basket as soon as it was free. Twisting up the yarn worked really nicely. Oh man, it would have been fun to do pink in all of those sections, but I'm glad to bring the greens back in and do a little bit more of a statement. But now I'm gonna go set this aside to cool and we'll do the final steam on these mops. For the final colorway, I decided to do something that was speckled-ish. Reusing the same dye bath from our variegated colorway, I added 300 grams of yarn and then started adding on the dry dye powder in little lines that crossed. I don't feel a need to have a ton of color coverage. We're really only going across the skein 1 or 2 times with each color, but we'll do this multiple times as we flip. And the reason why I called this speckle-ish is that we may end up with some speckles. I'm not intentionally spreading out the color, but it also might be a little bit more splotched. I did make sure to wait about 10 minutes in between each flip because I know some of the colors, especially Kelly Green, might need a little bit more time to strike. And I also knew that we would get some amount of spread and the base layer of the yarn wouldn't remain white. We'd get a bit of a more pastel color there. I added more water and acid as I felt it was needed to keep the levels a little bit consistent. And once I was satisfied with the amount of color that I'd added, I let everything heat for 30 minutes on the stove. You could totally do this same type of technique, but with spreading out the colors in their random patches. And you would get something that is more variegated, but a little bit more random than that first colorway that we created. It's always that decision to stir or not to stir that comes into play here. Because if I were to bring a spoon for it, the colors would spread more. But by not bringing a spoon, we get more concentrated colors in smaller sections. And so it's all just another decision that you can make with a technique that otherwise could start the same way. Ooh, maybe that would be a really fun video for me to do at some point, to do a side-by-side where I am in one pan moving the color and then in the other pan not moving the color. If that's something you would like to see, leave a comment and say, yes, do that experiment. I at least attempted to start with restraint, but ultimately, even though there's going to be a lot of more pastel areas and it'll feel speckled when worked up, I kept adding more and more color because that's what I wanted to do. I'm sure you noticed at the end I added some pink and tried to spread that out because we had some pink that spread on our other skeins. Let's watch the variegated colorway because I think this is likely the one that has the most dye on it. If one were to bleed, it might be this one. I plan on doing a lot of the rest off camera though. Oh. I'm really excited to see all the yarn dry together. And pleased to say I'm not seeing any color bleeding. Woohoo! Alright, I think that we're in really, really good shape. Oh, I like the way the green and the pink combine. I think I'm going to need to do deep magenta and emerald green dip dyed and see how they blend in the middle. I think that would be really pretty. But anyway, I'm going to put the yarn through my spin dryer. We'll wash the rest of the yarn off camera, but I'll pop in if I notice anything notable. Here is all the yarn that we dyed in today's video. I'm quickly going to go through the 3 main colorways and our yarn mop one at a time so you can see the details a little bit closer. Here is the color palette we ended up with. And yeah, the 2 pinks are similar, but I think if I had used just deep magenta, I wouldn't have been able to have the 2-tone quite as well with this technique. We could have picked a brighter green, but I really like the dirtiness of the lichen, the more muted quality, and how that pairs with all of the different colorways. So I'm actually really happy that I did that versus going for a more lime green. I am so glad that I decided to use some of the greens in the resists here versus just doing pink. I suppose I can move things so it matches up a little bit more. But I also have to say that the method I added the resists on this time was fast. It was only 2 zip ties per skein and it was fast to set up, fast to take off. So I might need to explore that particular way more in the future. Here is our speckled yarn. And you can see from up here, we have lots of color. This is a much quieter palette, but because from far away, you can see a lot of the pink and brighter green. When you knit it up, you know you'll end up with flecks of those colors that'll come through. Our lichen and forest green are definitely present in here as well. And those gave us some really nice, more defined speckles. The Kelly green does have a few speckles, but it strikes slower overall, so the colors are much more spread out. With our yarn mops, we have 2 that are very similar to one another. There's some minor dye lot differences, but both of these I had dry dye powder on my gloves that I wiped on. This yarn mop right here is a lot more pastel because what I had on my gloves was dye that was mixed in with water from dyeing our variegated colorway. So when I wiped it on, it was more liquid dye that I was wiping and therefore less concentrated. And that gave us this more pastel yarn mop. We have the potential to make some really, really lovely fade sets here. We could do a pastel, a speckled, a variegated, and then a resist. This would be a lovely fade. The other yarn mops could work in really, really nicely. There's many options here with a little color collection like this. I'm going to zoom in on our resist colorway to give a huge shout out and thank you to the ChemKnits Fiber patrons, including Michelle Martin, Tamara Spanes, Don Jans, Bernadette Crum, Jessica Parco, Karen Siegel, and the names you see on the screen right now. Patreon is a really great way that you all show me support every month, and there's some really fun perks that patrons can get, including early access to the newest Dyepot PS video every month, behind the scenes sneak peeks, and more. You can find more details over at patreon.com/ChemKnits. And thank you all patrons so much for all of your support. And you can even follow along for free. There are the occasional free posts, especially when I do a big pre-order or something, and so you can get an email notification when I launch something like SMSMS pre-orders or Hanukkah pre-orders or something like that. Now there's one more colorway that I really meant to create with this palette, and I haven't yet. And since I was ready to film the conclusions for this video, I decided to film a second video using our same inspiration photo to create a 4th main colorway. And some of the patrons may have already had a sneak peek for that because I featured that dyeing project in April's behind the scenes live stream, where I give patrons a little glimpse of a project that I'm working on for an episode of Dyepot Weekly. Don't worry, if you're not a patron, you'll get to see that video. I will publish it soon after this video is public, so you'll get a chance to see that soon. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I have some other birds that I plan to use for color inspiration in the upcoming months. These were all runners up to the poll where I asked patrons to vote on the color inspiration for a video. Feel free to let me know in the comments which one of these is your favorite, but I've likely, by the time you're seeing this, I've already dyed some yarn inspired by these colors. Thank you so much for watching.